In this lesson, we're going to learn how to recreate our final gather map for faster rendering and place our environment correctly in reference to the camera. So here's where we left off, and I've just opened up 06 Begin inside of our scene files. So we can see inside of our footage here that the ground is behind, or the camera is looking at this ground. So obviously our rotation of our dome is incorrect. So let's select our dome and hit the E key to grab our rotate tool, and let's rotate it until we're looking essentially at the ground here. Now we also want to make sure our lighting is correct, so let's just give ourselves a little bit of light over our subject here. Zoom in. And instead of it being sort of sideways, let's rotate this around so we're looking at something. Okay, so this is looking quite a bit better. We now have ground where our ground is supposed to be. So now let's double check this by just hitting the render key to make sure that our lighting and the final gather is consistent on our character's face. Now, we haven't yet rebuilt our final gather map yet, so when we're hitting this render, we're just taking a look at where the lighting source is coming from and making sure that it is consistent with the rest of our scene. So I'm going to pause the video during these renderings because, as you can see, they take quite a few seconds, so there's no need for us to sit here and wait while my computer churns through this render. Okay, so it just finished. So our lighting is predominantly coming from the left side, which is good and consistent, but it's a little bit sharp, so let's rotate our dome a little bit more to get the lighting over our person's face. So the light is going to be coming from these bright areas inside our HDR map here, so we just want to move those a little to the right. And now let's begin rebuilding or fixing our final gather map. So let's go to our render settings here, and let's jump over to the indirect lighting tab, and once this loads up, we're going to need to go down to the final gather map. Now, creating a final gather map and sort of baking it or caching it or not rebuilding it allows us to render much quicker and without any flickering. Now, it's only useful for objects that are not animated or moving, and since we're just using a camera animation, we can use a final gather map on this item. So to begin with, we need to have a final gather file defined, and in this scene file it is, but if it's not, you can just come over here and check Enable Map Visualizer and then uncheck it, and it will fill in the correct extension for you. Next, we're going to need to turn Rebuild from on to off. So what this is going to do is it's no longer going to calculate final gather points for points it already has. And actually, we need to be careful here because we just moved our lighting. So when we move our lighting, we need to make sure to turn Rebuild back to on, just for this first render. So if ever you move your lighting, make sure Rebuild is set to on, otherwise you're not going to see the lighting change reflected in your final gather map. And since this is going to take another 40 seconds, I'm going to pause the video until this is done rendering. Okay, this lighting looks much nicer. It's still predominantly being hit from the left side, but it's much more even. So once you have your lighting locked down, change your rebuild from on to off. And now your final gather or mental ray is going to read in from your file for these final gather points. So if we hit render, we're going to see that we render much more quickly because the final gather points are already calculated before we even hit render, and all mental ray is doing is reading them from its file. Now, to make sure that we have everything sort of baked in, let's jump over, or let's change the time so we can expose different parts of our model to this final gather. So we can see that our render time jumped from 37 seconds to 28 seconds. So let's just continue to cook in these final gather points. So we need to make sure to show as much of the model as possible. Now, if we don't go through this step and we change this to freeze, change rebuild to freeze, what we're going to see is that areas of our model that are not yet have any data for them will turn black. And so if you ever see your model turning black, make sure to switch your final gather back to off instead of freeze. So I'm just going to hit render again to bake those final gather points into our final gather map file. Okay, so now let's jump to the end of our animation where we see the other side of our model and hit render one last time. And again, depending on how complex your camera movement is, you may need to do this rendering step more or less often. And I'm sure Kyle has some very helpful lessons on doing this final gather mapping or baking in some of his courses or individual lessons. We're sort of just doing this as a nice way to speed up our renders for this project. Okay, and once we have our model rendered from a few different angles, with the rebuild turned off, we can now change our rebuild to freeze. And so take a look here. We have a render time of 37 seconds, but once we change it to freeze, what we should see is that our render time increases by quite a lot, because we are no longer calculating any final gather points. We are simply reading them from a file. So let me hold on till this renders. And now we can see we're back down to our time of about 27 seconds a frame. Now 10 seconds a frame over a sequence of 55 frames is going to be a couple minutes, maybe 10 minutes savings, which might not seem like a lot, but on a longer sequence or a larger frame, it's going to save us quite a bit of time. So now that we have our renders set up, sort of ready to go, let's now come in and take a look at our render layers and figure out what kind of layers we're going to want to create for compositing. So we'll begin working on that aspect of our Maya file in the next lesson.